The Roman Empire was experiencing a period of relative stability under the reign of Caesar Augustus, a period known as the Pax Romana, in which the provinces were firmly controlled and censuses were basic tools for organizing taxes, records, and military obligations. Within this administrative framework, the Gospel of Luke mentions an imperial edict that ordered a census throughout the territory, forcing families to travel to their cities of origin to be registered. Joseph, a descendant of the house of David, had to appear in Bethlehem, the ancient city of King David, which placed the setting outside his usual residence in Nazareth. The route from Nazareth to Bethlehem covered approximately 130 kilometers according to known historical roads. For a humble couple, the journey implied slow days, with constant stops, scarce inns, and rural areas where the danger of attacks or wild animals was a real concern. Mary was pregnant and, according to Luke, close to giving birth, making the journey even more demanding. In a century lacking medical conveniences, a trip of that magnitude represented an experience of physical and emotional vulnerability. Bethlehem at that time was a small town densely crowded due to the arrival of people for the census. Houses usually had an upper floor where the family slept and a lower level where animals were kept at night. The Gospel states that there was no room at the inn, a reference to the lack of available space in family accommodations, which forced Joseph and Mary to settle in a place intended for animals. The manger, a feeding trough carved from stone or wood, served as an improvised cradle for the newborn. The birth scene, according to the canonical accounts, is presented without fantastic embellishments. A child wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger in a rustic environment that reflected both material poverty and the symbolic burden that later Christian tradition would highlight. The Hebrew prophets had mentioned Bethlehem as the cradle of a future leader for Israel, giving the place a spiritual resonance that early Christians interpreted as the fulfillment of messianic expectations. In the nearby fields, shepherds watched over their flocks at night. Shepherds were part of a marginal social class in the Jewish structure of the first century, often viewed with suspicion due to their nomadic lifestyle and the difficulty of complying with strict ritual norms. However, the Gospel of Luke places them as the first to receive the announcement of the birth. A heavenly messenger told them that a child had been born who would be the Savior, using language loaded with political and religious significance for Judea under Roman rule. The message to the shepherds included a concrete sign. They would find the child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. This simple and unusual description allowed them to identify the newborn without resorting to extraordinary elements. When they went to Bethlehem, the shepherds found the family in the indicated place, in an everyday scene of a humble birth, without the dramatizations that later Christian iconography would develop. Mary kept all these things, pondering them in her heart, a phrase suggesting introspection and awareness that this experience exceeded the normality of her situation. Rome, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the details of the birth. For the imperial authorities, Bethlehem was merely a minor point within the province of Judea. However, for the Jewish population, any mention of a Davidic descendant generated expectations of national restoration. The spiritual atmosphere of the period was marked by an intense anticipation of the Messiah, a liberating figure who, according to prophetic interpretations, would emerge in times of oppression. The contrast between the expected grandeur and the actual poverty of the scene in Bethlehem highlighted the uniqueness of the Gospel account. The canonical record describes the birth as a silent and secluded event, without the participation of political or religious authorities. There are no crowds, no priests, no public proclamations. The arrival of Jesus is placed at the opposite end of the Roman protocol for the birth of significant figures where omens, banquets, and ceremonies were customary. Instead, the Gospel Chronicle presents an environment of total rusticity, a village stable crowded by census visitors, a young family far from home, and shepherds who arrive as unexpected witnesses. The fact that the child was born in Bethlehem and not in Nazareth, where Joseph and Mary resided, created a convergence between political events and religious expectations. Augustus's census acted as a driver to move the family toward the Davidic city, while ancient Hebrew prophecies gave spiritual significance to the place. The account does not develop miraculous effects or extraordinary phenomena on the night of the birth beyond the announcement to the shepherds, leaving the focus on the humanity of the event. Bethlehem continued to be during those days a saturated and effervescent hub due to the arrival of temporary migrants. The presence of a newborn in such austere conditions would not have been exceptional in the socio-economic reality of Judea. What the Gospel narrative highlights is the subsequent interpretation that the Christian community would attribute to this episode, the contrast between the smallness of the setting and the magnitude of the message attributed to the newborn child. The three wise men and Herod's pursuit. The Gospel of Matthew recounts the arrival of some magi, a term that referred to wise men or astrologers from eastern regions, who had observed a celestial phenomenon interpreted as a sign of the birth of a king of the Jews. Although later tradition would make them kings, their original functions were closer to astronomical observation and the interpretation of celestial signs, practices common in Persia, Babylon, and other Eastern cultures. The account does not specify their number, only that they carried three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, symbolic elements in ancient culture. Their presence in Judea suggested that the birth that occurred in Bethlehem resonated beyond its borders. These men first arrived in Jerusalem, the religious and administrative capital of the region, seeking information. Their question, "Where is the King of the Jews who has been born?" caused immediate concern in the royal palace. Herod the Great, installed by Rome as a client king, was known for his obsession with retaining power. His reign had been marked by intrigues, internal executions, and strategic alliances to maintain Roman favor. Any rumor about a potential rival was enough to trigger severe investigations. Herod consulted the priests and scribes of the temple, who identified Bethlehem as the place indicated by the prophecies for the birth of the Messiah. This did not imply religious approval. The priests simply cited well-known texts from the Hebrew tradition. The king, upon learning of this interpretation, secretly summoned the Magi to determine the time when they had seen the sign in the heavens. This detail is not developed in the narrative core, but is key to understanding the subsequent chronology of the persecution. Herod asked the wise men to go to Bethlehem and report back to him. He presented himself as an ally interested in worshipping the child, but the real purpose was to eliminate any threat to his throne. The underlying political tension was present in every gesture of the monarch, an aged but still feared man, famous for executing even members of his family when he suspected conspiracies. The Magi set out for Bethlehem, a journey of a few kilometers from Jerusalem. The text mentions that the celestial sign reappeared and stopped over the place where the child was, language that reflects the ancient perception of celestial bodies as divine guides, although without details about their physical nature. They arrived at the house, not the stable, indicating that the family was no longer at the birthplace, and found the child with his mother. They then presented three gifts: gold, associated with royalty; frankincense, a liturgical element of sacred rituals; and myrrh, a resin used in ointments and funerary preparations. In the context of the 1st century, these elements were valuable but also common in caravan trade from Arabia and Mesopotamia. Their symbolic meaning would later be interpreted by Christian tradition, but in the account, they simply represent costly gifts offered to a child whose destiny was already beginning to leave marks even outside Israel. The wise men received a dream warning them not to return to Herod. Secretly, they took another route to return to their lands. The silence of the palace and the absence of news confirmed Herod's suspicions. He had been deceived. The monarch's anger flared, and in a characteristic reaction of his regime, he ordered a brutal action. Matthew narrates that Herod commanded the killing of all children under 2 years old in Bethlehem and its surroundings, a measure consistent with his documented history of preventive violence. The number does not appear in the account, but considering the small population size, historians estimate that the number of victims would have been relatively low in absolute terms, though devastating for such a small community. The episode, known as the Massacre of the Innocents, reflects the political climate of Judea in the time of Herod, a kingdom where stability was maintained through a mix of public works, administrative reforms, and lethal repression. The goal was to ensure that any messianic prophecy, interpreted as a potential focus of rebellion, was neutralized before it could become a real threat. In parallel, Joseph received a message in a dream instructing him to flee immediately to Egypt with Mary and the child. In the 1st century, Egypt was a prosperous Roman province with a significant Jewish population established for centuries, especially in Alexandria. It was a reasonable destination for refugees seeking temporary protection beyond the reach of a local monarch. The journey from Bethlehem to the Egyptian border involved several days of travel, passing through safe trade routes but not without natural and human dangers. The flight to Egypt placed the family within a common pattern among refugees of the ancient world. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus integrated into a country where organized Jewish communities existed capable of providing basic support to newcomers. The Gospel does not describe details of their stay, only mentioning that they remained there until Herod's death. The king's reign of terror ended with his passing, which occurred in 4 BC, after which his territories were divided among his sons, reconfiguring the political map of the region. After the monarch's death, Joseph again received instructions to return to Israel. But upon learning that Archelaus, one of Herod's sons, ruled Judea, he feared settling there and instead went to Galilee. Thus the family settled in Nazareth, a small village with no political or religious weight, far from centers of power and control. This move closed the cycle that had begun with the Roman census and Herodian persecution. When the family finally settled in Nazareth, the child grew up far from the turmoil that had surrounded his early years, in a rural environment where life was organized by seasons, manual labor, and ancient customs. And while that final settlement marked the beginning of a quiet childhood, it also began the least documented and most mysterious stage of his life: childhood in Nazareth and the hidden years. Nazareth, in the 1st century, was a small village situated in the hills of Galilee, an agricultural region crossed by secondary roads and inhabited by modest Jewish communities. It does not appear in historical texts outside the Gospels, suggesting its small size and limited importance during that period. The houses were usually built with local limestone, flat roofs, and small rooms that shared space with domestic workshops. In this rural and isolated environment, Jesus' childhood began, far from cities like Jerusalem or Sepphoris, where political, religious, and commercial activity was more intense. The economy of Nazareth was marked by manual labor. Joseph was a tekton, a Greek term that designated artisans who worked with wood, stone, or both materials. In a region where stone was abundant and wood scarce, the trade combined multiple skills: repair of agricultural tools, construction of beams, making frames, doors, yokes, and basic elements for houses and barns. Children, from an early age, usually accompanied their parents at work, learning by observation and practice. It is reasonable to think that Jesus grew up within this daily rhythm, helping with simple tasks typical for a child of his community. Jewish family life was deeply connected to festivals, daily prayers, and the observance of the law. Education began at home. Mary and Joseph would have taught their son the traditional prayers, the commandments, and the stories of the Hebrew Bible. The local synagogue played a fundamental educational role. There, the reading of the Torah was heard, psalms were recited, and children learned to interpret sacred texts. In a context where literacy was not universal, oral transmission carried decisive weight. Memory, rhythm, and repetition shaped the way children absorbed the spiritual content of their culture. The Gospel of Luke summarizes this stage with a brief but meaningful phrase: "The child grew, became strong, and was filled with wisdom." This statement emphasizes integral development, physical, intellectual, and spiritual, without providing specific anecdotes. The silence about Jesus' childhood is not unusual in ancient biographical literature, which often focused on adulthood and episodes of public relevance. Later tradition would attempt to fill these gaps with apocryphal stories, but the canonical Gospels remained sober, leaving those years as a silent stage. First-century Galilee was a cultural mosaic. Although predominantly Jewish, it was influenced by Roman presence, Hellenized cities, and trade routes crossing the region. Sepphoris, located a few kilometers from Nazareth, was one of the most important urban centers. After the death of Herod, the city was rebuilt and beautified, becoming a strategic administrative point. Although the Gospels do not mention Jesus or Joseph working there, many Galilean artisans traveled to Sepphoris in search of employment, suggesting possible indirect contact with more urban and multilingual environments. The child Jesus, even living in a small village, grew up in a region connected to the Roman world. Religious learning included memorizing the Shema Israel, the central prayer of Judaism, and participating in annual festivals such as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. These celebrations not only marked the spiritual calendar but also the social rhythm of communities. Families traveled together to Jerusalem when circumstances allowed, reinforcing the Jewish people's identity ties to their sacred capital. Luke will later indicate one of these trips, when Jesus was 12 years old. Life in Nazareth unfolded between agricultural work, crafts, and community practices. Subsistence farming, consisting of wheat, barley, vineyards, and olive trees, defined much of the economy. Families participated in harvesting, making oil and wine, and maintaining agricultural terraces built to prevent hillside erosion. Children also contributed with simple tasks, fetching water, helping care for small animals, carrying light loads. Jesus would have shared this daily routine with children of his age, a practical education shaping habits of discipline, endurance, and solidarity. Jewish identity was deeply tied to the observance of the law. From an early age, Jesus would have learned dietary rules, days of rest, the importance of ritual purity, and the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the people. Galilee, despite its geographical distance from the capital, maintained a close relationship with religious traditions. Synagogues functioned as centers of community cohesion, especially in rural areas where daily life was governed by both work and spirituality. The silence of the Gospels regarding Jesus' adolescence, a period commonly called the hidden years, has been a source of curiosity for centuries. However, the absence of extraordinary accounts emphasizes an implicit teaching. Jesus lived a common childhood within a working-class Jewish family. He grew up without political or economic privileges in a peripheral region, in contact with the harshness of manual labor and the demands of rural life. His later knowledge of the scriptures, his oratory skills, and his deep understanding of first-century Jewish society were nurtured in this domestic and community environment. The political tensions of the region were part of this backdrop. After the death of Herod, Judea came under direct Roman control, while Galilee was governed by Herod Antipas, another of the former king's sons. The Roman administration imposed strict taxes, monitored population movements, and maintained a military presence at strategic points. Although these tensions did not directly affect daily life in villages like Nazareth, they shaped the general climate of uncertainty, messianic expectation, and cultural resistance that characterized the Jewish people. Jesus' growth in this environment combined an identity deeply rooted in Israel's traditions with indirect exposure to external influences. His spiritual formation, his sensitivity toward the marginalized, and his understanding of the everyday life of peasants, artisans, and fishermen were born on the dusty, silent roads of Galilee. Jesus at 12 years old in the temple. Passover was the main festival of the Jewish calendar, commemorating the liberation of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Every year, thousands of pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices and participate in the rituals of the temple, the spiritual center of the nation. Luke recounts that Joseph and Mary regularly attended this celebration, indicating their devotion and faithfulness to the law. When Jesus turned 12, the age before formal recognition of religious responsibility, they made the journey with him from Nazareth to the Holy City. It was a several-day journey following known routes that bordered the Jordan Valley before ascending toward the hills of Judea. The pilgrimage was made in family caravans. Groups were organized to protect themselves from bandits and share resources. Children usually traveled with relatives or neighbors, playing, learning liturgical songs, and observing the changing landscape as they ascended toward Jerusalem. The capital, with its temple visible from a distance, was an impressive sight for those arriving for the first time or for those, like Jesus, who visited it annually on special festivals. For a child from Galilee, the magnitude of the temple must have evoked profound awe. The spacious courtyards, priests in white garments, the Levites' chants, and the constant movement of pilgrims offered a sensory experience different from rural life. Jerusalem was a meeting point between tradition, religious authority, and economic activity. The Roman presence was visible through soldiers stationed in strategic locations, reminding that the Holy City lived under imperial supervision. Passover involved days of rituals, teachings, and prayers. After fulfilling the festival's obligations, the caravans began the return journey. Joseph and Mary started the march back to Nazareth, believing Jesus was with other family members. It was an understandable mistake in the context of large groups where young people and children moved freely among relatives. Only at the end of the day, when they looked for their son in different segments of the caravan, did they discover he was not there. Concern turned into urgency. They immediately returned to Jerusalem, a city that, by that date, was still full of pilgrims who had not finished their stays. They searched in markets, squares, inns, and familiar streets without obtaining concrete information. The search lasted 3 days, a period the account emphasizes with a tone of family anguish before revealing the unexpected discovery. Jesus was in the temple, sitting among the teachers of the law. The teachers were educated men, experts in the scriptures and traditional interpretations. The temple courtyards were spaces where these teachers conversed, explained biblical passages, and debated theological questions. It was common for pilgrims to listen to these discussions, but unusual for a child to participate actively. Luke describes Jesus listening and asking questions. This detail is significant because in the Jewish world, learning was based both on asking and answering. Questions indicated genuine interest and the ability to understand profound subjects. The teachers, surprised, not only appreciated his curiosity but also his intelligence and clarity in dialogue. The Gospel mentions that those who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers, a remarkable recognition given the hierarchical and formal context of religious instruction in the first century. When Joseph and Mary found him, their reaction was that of any family after an anxious situation. Mary expressed her bewilderment and pain over the concern they had experienced. Jesus' response, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" marked a decisive point in the canonical narrative, an early assertion of identity and mission expressed clearly by an adolescent who already understood something fundamental about his purpose. It was not a challenging statement, but a revelation about his relationship with God and his spiritual orientation. However, after this revealing episode, Jesus returned with his parents to Nazareth and remained under their authority. The account emphasizes his obedience and continuous development. He grew in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and men. The scene has a dual character. On one hand, it shows a deep awareness in the young Jesus. On the other, it returns him to the normal rhythm of family life, emphasizing that his preparation would not be public until much later. The episode at 12 years old also illuminates important elements of the historical context. In Jewish tradition, children began to assume religious responsibility from that age. The journey to Jerusalem for Passover had a strong formative character as it symbolized the transition to fuller participation in the spiritual life of the people. Jesus experienced that transition within the social and cultural structure of his community, but with an inner dimension that the account only allows glimpses of. The scene in the temple reflects the centrality that Jerusalem held for any devout Jew. The fact that this is the only recorded episode of Jesus' adolescence underscores its uniqueness. There are no more stories of his youth. The Gospels remain deliberately silent about the following decades. This silence highlights that his public life began only when he reached adult maturity, and that the intermediate stage, though hidden, was one of inner growth and silent preparation. After that journey, the family resumed their routine in Nazareth. Learning in the synagogue, artisan work alongside Joseph, and integration into a rural community continued to shape his days. No other canonical account interrupts that silence until, decades later, a figure in the desert would begin to preach a message calling all Israel to repentance. John the Baptist and the beginning of the public ministry. When Jesus reached approximately 30 years of age, the narrative silence of his private life was interrupted by the appearance of a prophetic figure who resonated strongly throughout Judea, John the Baptist. The Gospels present him as an austere man dressed in camel hair and fed on locusts and wild honey, symbols of a withdrawn existence in the desert. His presence evoked the ancient prophets of Israel, especially Elijah, both in appearance and in his direct and confrontational style. The region where he preached, near the Jordan Valley, was an arid landscape that accentuated the radical character of his message. John's call was clear, a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. The act of immersion in water symbolized an inner transformation and a sincere return to God. In a society marked by political tensions, messianic expectations, and strict religious norms, his preaching attracted crowds. The Gospels describe people from Jerusalem, Judea, and the entire Jordan region coming to hear his message. Many wondered if he himself would be the expected Messiah, but John categorically denied it and announced the arrival of someone more powerful. The baptismal rite he practiced had a particular meaning. For the Jews, purifications with water were well known, but John's baptism implied a deep moral commitment, a public acknowledgement of spiritual need. His preaching denounced social injustice, corruption, and hypocrisy. He demanded honesty from soldiers, asked tax collectors not to abuse their office, and called the people in general to share with those who had no clothing or food. His message had a strong ethical component that prepared the ground for something greater. It was in this scenario that Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan. The evangelist Matthew recounts that John was surprised to see him among the crowd, recognizing in him a spiritual authority higher than his own. He tried to prevent it, saying that he should be baptized by Jesus, but Jesus insisted on fulfilling all righteousness. Baptism in this sense did not imply confession of sin on the part of Jesus, but an act of identification with the people, a necessary step within the divine plan according to the canonical account. When Jesus came up from the water, the Gospels mention two key elements. The heavens opened, and the Spirit descended like a dove, while a voice proclaimed that he was the beloved Son. The symbolic language of the Spirit's descent reflects a public designation of his mission, a formal beginning of his ministry. The evangelists do not describe a spectacular phenomenon visible to all, but a deeply meaningful experience that marked the start of a new stage. After his baptism, Jesus did not immediately begin preaching. Instead, he was led by the Spirit into the desert. This detail frames his mission in continuity with the experience of the people of Israel, who wandered in the desert before entering the Promised Land, and with the path of the prophets who withdrew to discern their vocation. The desert, in biblical thought, was a place of trial, purification, and spiritual encounter. And although this chapter does not yet develop those trials, it places Jesus on the threshold of a direct confrontation with the forces that sought to divert him from his purpose. John's figure continued to exert significant influence while Jesus prepared to begin his ministry. Despite Jesus' emergence, crowds continued to come to the Baptist, indicating that his preaching had generated a considerable movement. Some of his disciples, such as Andrew, would end up following Jesus, thus directly connecting John's ministry with that of the one he announced. Historically, John's impact also drew the attention of the authorities. His denunciation of Herod Antipas for his relationship with Herodias would lead to his arrest and eventual death. This episode, recounted later, demonstrates that prophetic preaching had real political consequences in a region where instability was constant and where any religious movement could be interpreted as a threat. Jesus' baptism inaugurated a stage full of meaning within the canonical narrative. From this moment, Jesus becomes a public figure, endowed with spiritual authority and recognized by a divine manifestation. The desert would be the first stage where this authority would be tested before he began calling disciples and proclaiming the kingdom of God through villages and cities of Galilee and Judea. The temptation in the desert. After his baptism in the Jordan, Jesus entered the desert, guided, according to the Gospels, by the Spirit. The desert region of Judea was an inhospitable landscape. Rocky hills, deep ravines, sparse vegetation, and an absolute silence interrupted only by the wind or by animals adapted to those extreme conditions. There, far from villages and traveled roads, Jesus remained 40 days. The number, laden with biblical resonance, evoked episodes such as the 40 years of Israel in the desert and the 40 days of Moses on Sinai. More than an exact figure, the expression conveyed a prolonged period of preparation, solitude, and confrontation. During that time, Jesus fasted. The practice of fasting was common in first-century Judaism, linked to repentance, the search for discernment, and dependence on God. However, such an extended fast would have left him physically weakened. The evangelists emphasize that at the end of the period, Jesus was hungry, a statement that highlights his full humanity. It was in that physical vulnerability that the confrontation with the figure the Gospels call Satan, the adversary, developed, whose goal was to divert Jesus' mission even before it began publicly. The first temptation occurred in direct relation to his basic need. The tempter suggested that he turn stones into bread, appealing both to hunger and to the possibility of using his authority immediately and self-centeredly. Jesus' response quoted scripture, "Man shall not live by bread alone," reminding that human dependence is not limited to the material. The rejection did not imply denying the importance of food, but rejecting the use of power for individual ends outside the divine purpose he recognized as central. The second temptation took place on a high point of the temple in Jerusalem. The Gospels describe this movement without detailing the mechanics, focusing on the symbolism of the challenge, throwing himself into the void to demonstrate that angels would sustain him. Satan, according to the account, even cited a psalm to support his proposal, manipulating scripture for his own benefit. Jesus responded with another biblical quotation, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God." The temptation aimed to force a spectacular manifestation that would compel belief through visual impact, a path of display that Jesus rejected. The third temptation led Jesus to a high mountain from which, symbolically, the tempter showed him the kingdoms of the world. The offer consisted of granting him authority over them in exchange for worship. This proposal attacked the core of the concept of messianism in Jewish culture. Many expected a political leader capable of freeing Israel from Roman rule and establishing an earthly kingdom. The temptation, therefore, appealed to an immediate path to power without suffering or sacrifice. Jesus rejected it again by quoting scripture, "Only God is to be worshipped." The refusal closed any possibility of messianism based on political domination or alliances with forces opposed to the divine purpose he claimed to follow. After this triple confrontation, the Gospels say that the tempter withdrew for a time, implying that spiritual pressures and opposition would not disappear but would return at critical moments. The presence of angels who assisted him at the end of the fast suggests physical and emotional restoration after the intense experience without adding extraordinary details beyond an act of comfort and strengthening. The desert, in biblical tradition, was a place where identities were revealed. In Israel's history, the journey through the desert defined the people's relationship with God. For the prophets, the desert symbolized the space outside urban corruption where divine will was discerned. In Jesus' case, this period acted as a filter that clarified the type of mission he would undertake, not a mission oriented toward power, spectacle, or self-benefit, but one centered on faithfulness, humility, and service. The experience of temptation also emphasizes Jesus' humanity. The Gospels do not present him as a being immune to hunger, exhaustion, or psychological pressure. The narrative highlights his ability to resist through obedience to God and the proper use of Scripture, which appears as moral and spiritual guidance. This initial resistance prepares the reader for future confrontations with religious authorities, with misunderstood crowds, and with disciples who at times will not understand the nature of his message. After overcoming the trial, Jesus left the desert ready to begin his public ministry. The Gospel of Luke mentions that he returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, a phrase that directly connects victory and temptation with the authority of his later preaching. His message would begin to resonate in synagogues, villages, and roads he traveled on foot, accompanied by ordinary men who would gradually join him. The choosing of the 12 apostles. After returning from the desert, Jesus began preaching in the region of Galilee. The initial message, according to the Gospels, could be summarized in one sentence: "The kingdom of God is near." It was not a political kingdom in the Roman sense, but a spiritual reality that invited conversion and the transformation of the heart. His preaching began in local synagogues, places where he was allowed to read and teach like any adult Jewish man. His interpretation of the scriptures, direct and authoritative, caused surprise and, on some occasions, controversy. Jesus' popularity grew rapidly. Crowds came to hear him, seeking spiritual answers, healing, or simply the curiosity of seeing a teacher different from the traditional rabbis. The pressure of the crowds made evident the need for collaborators. The Gospels show that Jesus did not choose scholars, aristocrats, or influential figures, but ordinary men whose daily lives were carried out in manual trades. His choice was not casual. He had to train those who would continue his mission after his departure, and the criterion was not social status but inner disposition. The calling of the first disciples took place by the Sea of Galilee. Simon, later known as Peter, and his brother Andrew were casting nets when Jesus approached. He said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." The expression evoked a new purpose. They would no longer catch fish, but would draw people toward the message of the kingdom. The brothers immediately left their nets, a gesture reflecting both Jesus' authority and their deep willingness to change their lives. Soon after, Jesus called James and John, sons of Zebedee, also fishermen. He found them repairing nets with their father. They left the boat and the family business to follow him. In a society where the continuity of a trade was part of family identity, this abandonment symbolized a radical commitment. The small initial circle was made up of Galilean fishermen, men accustomed to hard work, nights of labor, economic uncertainty, and mutual collaboration. Another important call was that of Matthew, also called Levi in some accounts, a tax collector. His profession placed him on the social margin, associated with collaboration with Rome and abusive practices. Tax collectors were seen as impure and traitorous. The fact that Jesus chose him challenged the social and religious norms of his time. Matthew left his post, hosted a banquet at his house, and gathered other tax collectors, an event that provoked criticism from Pharisees, scandalized by Jesus' closeness to people considered sinners. Jesus chose 12 main disciples from a larger group of followers. The number 12 had an evident symbolism. It recalled the 12 tribes of Israel, suggesting the idea of a new spiritual beginning for the people. The Gospels agree on the general list of the apostles: Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Each came from a different social background, but all shared the invitation to leave the ordinary to join a mission they did not yet fully understand. Some had impulsive personalities, others a critical mindset or inner reservations. Peter would be the impulsive and passionate leader of the group, John, the contemplative young man close to Jesus, Thomas, the analytical one who questioned everything, Simon the Zealot, linked to a resistance movement against Rome. The diversity of the group reflected the inclusive reach of Jesus' message, capable of calling men from opposing backgrounds. The Gospels show moments when Jesus withdrew to pray before making important decisions, including the selection of the 12. This practice emphasizes the seriousness of the process. The choice did not depend on merits or prior knowledge, but on the willingness to be trained under his guidance. The apostles would witness his preaching, works, and his way of relating to people. They would learn through daily life, traveling with him from village to village, observing his treatment of the sick, marginalized religious leaders, and ordinary families. The formation of the 12 also involved teaching them to let go of mistaken expectations. Many Jews expected a political Messiah who would expel the Romans, and some apostles may have shared that initial vision. Jesus, however, redefined the concept of leadership: to serve instead of dominate, to forgive instead of seek revenge, and to seek the lost instead of condemn. This transformation of mindset would be fundamental for their future role. The group began accompanying him through villages, roads, and synagogues of Galilee. The Gospels describe intense days. Jesus taught, healed, cast out spirits, and announced good news. The reputation of the group grew, along with the opposition of some religious leaders who considered his approach to the law and his closeness to marginalized sectors problematic. In this climate of expansion, the 12 apostles were not passive observers. Jesus prepared them so that, when the time came, they would be sent to proclaim the kingdom themselves. Their doubts, internal discussions, and mistakes were recorded in the canonical texts as evidence of their humanity and the patience with which Jesus instructed them. The authority they received grew progressively, always tied to the message their teacher embodied. With the 12 gathered, Jesus' ministry entered a new phase. The group would serve as the foundation for his public work, as witnesses of his teachings, and as future transmitters of his message. The miracles that defined his ministry. With the 12 disciples already gathered, Jesus' public activity began to intensify. The villages of Galilee, with their dirt roads, adobe houses, and small synagogues, were the setting for the first works that the Gospels describe as signs of his authority. In a region accustomed to chronic illnesses, limited medical resources, and a religious system that linked disease with impurity, each act of healing had profound physical and social repercussions. The miracles were not presented as exhibitions, but as gestures directed towards specific people in desperate situations. One of the first episodes recounted occurs in Capernaum, a fishing town on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. There, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, who lay with a fever. The account is brief and sober. Jesus approached, took her by the hand, and the fever left her. The woman immediately got up and began to serve them, a detail that reflected the cultural understanding of service as a gesture of gratitude and restoration of normality. That same afternoon at sunset, when the Sabbath ended and people could move without fear of violating the law, the house filled with sick people and those affected by various ailments. Jesus attended to many, consolidating his reputation throughout the region. Other healings stood out for their symbolic impact. A leper approached Jesus, defying the ritual norms that required these patients to remain apart. Lepers faced social and religious isolation. Jesus, moved by compassion, extended his hand and touched the man, a remarkable gesture in a context where any physical contact with a leper generated ritual impurity. The Gospel notes that the leprosy disappeared immediately. Jesus asked him to present himself to the priest, following the procedure established in the law to confirm the healing. This act combined mercy with respect for religious institutions, avoiding unnecessary misunderstandings. The forgiveness of the paralytic's sins in Capernaum also caused a change in public perception. A group of friends, unable to enter through the crowd, opened the roof of a house to lower the sick man on a stretcher. Jesus, seeing the faith of these men, declared his sins forgiven. The scribes present considered this blasphemy, for in Jewish understanding only God could forgive directly. To respond to this challenge, Jesus commanded the paralytic to rise and walk. The man stood before all, an act that reinforced both theological controversy and Jesus' growing fame. Later in 9, Jesus encountered a funeral procession. A young man had died, leaving his mother a widow without support. In a society without social safety nets, the loss of the only son meant condemnation to extreme poverty. Jesus approached, touched the coffin, and spoke to the young man, who came back to life according to the account. The scene is charged with human significance. Beyond the extraordinary element, the gesture restored not only a life, but the dignity and future of a vulnerable family. The calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee was another emblematic episode. The fishermen who followed Jesus knew well the dangers of sudden storms on that lake where winds descended with force from the Golan Heights. One night, while crossing by boat, a storm threatened to sink them. Jesus was sleeping, exhausted from the day. The disciples, frightened, woke him. He got up and rebuked the wind and the sea, which calmed immediately. The impact on the disciples was profound. "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" they asked themselves. The episode was not intended to create spectacle, but revealed the authority Jesus exercised over natural forces. Other works provoked intense reactions among religious authorities. In a synagogue, Jesus healed a man with a paralyzed hand on the Sabbath. The Pharisees watched to accuse him, since the law forbade doing work on the Sabbath. Jesus asked if it was lawful to do good on that day, and after their silence, restored the man's hand. This act directly confronted the rigid interpretation of the law, showing a principle that would guide all his teaching. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Gospels also recount exorcisms, understood in the context of the first century as restorations of health in the face of severe physical or psychological afflictions. In Capernaum, a possessed man burst into the synagogue screaming. Jesus rebuked him, and the man was restored. These episodes, beyond their later interpretations, reflect a constant pattern. Jesus returned control, dignity, and balance to people who lived marginalized because of their conditions. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes was one of the most remembered events. About 5,000 people had followed Jesus to a remote place, and the late hour made finding food difficult. A boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish. According to the account, Jesus blessed the food and asked that it be distributed. Everyone ate and baskets were left over. The episode, beyond its spiritual dimension, showed Jesus' ability to mobilize his followers towards solidarity in times of need. For his part, the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, a synagogue leader, showed Jesus' relationship with influential and humble people alike. As he went to their house, he received the news that the girl had died. Jesus reassured the father and continued on his way. In the room, accompanied only by the parents and 3 disciples, he took the girl by the hand, and she rose. The scene remained discreet, indicating that the purpose was not notoriety but compassion. The main parables and teachings. As Jesus' ministry grew, so did the need to communicate profound truths in a way that was understandable for diverse audiences. peasants, fishermen, artisans, mothers, elders, the sick, tax collectors, curious Pharisees, and crowds coming from villages and cities. In that cultural context where much of the teaching relied on memory and oral transmission, Jesus used a pedagogical resource that would become distinctive in his message, the parable. These short stories, drawn from everyday life, contained spiritual meanings that invited reflection without resorting to complex theological treatises. One of the most well-known parables is that of the prodigal son. In it, a younger son demands his inheritance early, leaves his father's house, and squanders his wealth. When he hits rock bottom, humiliated and without means, he decides to return. His father receives him with an embrace and organizes a celebration, to the displeasure of the older brother who had remained faithful at home. The story reflected common situations in peasant families: tensions over inheritance, youthful mistakes, resentments among siblings. However, its meaning went further. It illustrated the unexpected generosity of forgiveness and questioned the hardness of judgment. Jesus does not comment on or explain every detail. He lets the audience identify their own place in the story. Another fundamental parable is that of the Good Samaritan. A man is attacked on a dangerous road and left injured. A priest and a Levite, that is, respected religious figures, pass by and both avoid helping him. Instead, a Samaritan, a member of a people despised by the Jews, stops, attends to his wounds, and pays for his care. In the first century, hostility between Jews and Samaritans was deep, sustained by religious differences and historical disputes. By presenting the Samaritan as an example of compassion, Jesus challenged ingrained cultural prejudices. The central question, who was the neighbor of the injured man, was not seeking theory but concrete action. There is also the parable of the sower, where a farmer scatters seeds that fall on different types of ground, along the path, on rocky soil, among thorns, and on good soil. The seeds represent the message, the soils, the different dispositions of the heart. Some do not listen, others listen but become discouraged, others are distracted by worries and wealth, and others bear fruit. The parable reflected the real experience of Galilean peasants, accustomed to uneven soils and agricultural uncertainty. The teaching focused on inner receptivity, not on the skill of the sower. The kingdom of heaven, a recurring theme in Jesus' preaching, was frequently explained through small everyday images. He compared the kingdom to a mustard seed, tiny but capable of becoming a robust shrub where birds make nests. He also compared it to yeast that a woman mixes with flour, invisible while acting but transformative in its final effect. These images indicated a pattern. What begins almost imperceptibly can produce unexpected and expansive results. The parable of the hidden treasure and that of the pearl of great price emphasize the incomparable value of the kingdom. A man discovers a hidden treasure in a field, sells everything he has, and buys the land. Another merchant finds an exceptional pearl and also sells everything to acquire it. Both parables evoke the idea of total renunciation for something of higher value. In rural societies where resources were limited, these stories conveyed the idea of a radical decision based on deep valuation. Another notable teaching appears in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two men go up to the temple to pray. One boasts of his religious virtues, the other humbly acknowledges his faults. Jesus states that the second, not the first, went home justified. The story questioned spiritual self-sufficiency and proposed humility as the foundation for the relationship with God. By using a tax collector as a positive example, a figure popularly despised for collaborating with Rome, Jesus continued to break pre-established social patterns. Parables not only taught, they also provoked. On occasion, the disciples asked for explanations in private, showing that even those who followed him closely needed time to understand them. Jesus pointed out that parables revealed truths to those willing to truly listen, while those looking for reasons to criticize him or trap him in contradictions found them enigmatic. In a culture where moral teaching was usually direct, this strategy invited personal reflection more than mechanical obedience. In addition to parables, Jesus offered direct teachings that expanded his central message. He insisted on forgiveness as a constant practice, even proposing that one forgive 70 times 7, a symbolic number indicating no limits. He taught to pray without ostentation and to prioritize inner sincerity over appearance. He criticized obsessive accumulation of wealth, reminding that life does not depend on the possessions one has. He called to love even enemies, a countercultural attitude in a people under foreign domination. His teaching about the kingdom also included warnings. He compared the end of times to the separation of wheat and weeds, where the true quality is revealed only at the end. He taught that saying, "Lord, Lord," is not enough. It is necessary to live according to the divine will. He questioned empty religious practices, pointing out that ritual without justice or mercy lost its meaning. The Sermon on the Mount and its moral revolution. In the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount is presented as one of the culminating moments of Jesus' ministry. It was not a political speech nor a tirade against Rome, but a profound exposition on the moral, spiritual, and communal life proposed by the kingdom of God. The scene unfolds on a hill near the Sea of Galilee, a place where the crowd could gather and hear clearly as the wind carried the words down the slope. Jesus sat and began to speak to disciples and listeners in a tone that challenged the religious categories of his time. The sermon begins with the Beatitudes, a series of statements that inverted the dominant values. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, those who seek peace. In a world where military strength, economic power, and religious status defined social hierarchy, these statements granted spiritual dignity to those who lacked them. They were not praise for suffering itself, but promises addressed to those living in vulnerability, injustice, or profound humility. With them, Jesus outlined the identity of those who belonged to the kingdom he proclaimed. Then he declared his followers salt of the earth and light of the world. In first-century Galilee, salt had multiple uses. It preserved food, added flavor, and purified. Light, in turn, was a symbol of guidance and revelation. These metaphors indicated an active, not passive role for those who accepted his teaching. It was not about withdrawing from the world, but influencing it through a transformed life. A central part of the Sermon on the Mount addressed the relationship with the law of Moses. Jesus affirmed that he had not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it fully. Yet his interpretation went beyond external observance. Where the law said, "You shall not murder," Jesus deepened it by pointing out that anger against another person was already a form of moral breach. Where the law forbade adultery, Jesus invited vigilance even over inner desire. The ethics he proposed did not eliminate the law, but internalized it, demanding a coherence more radical than mere ritual observance. The teaching on reconciliation was equally demanding. Before presenting an offering in the temple, Jesus asked to resolve any pending conflict with a brother. In a society where family honor and public reputation were essential, this message emphasized that true devotion included justice and interpersonal repair. Spirituality could not be separated from daily life. The discourse also reconfigured the understanding of retributive justice. Against the principle of an eye for an eye, Jesus presented the path of not responding with violence to personal offense. Turning the other cheek, giving also the cloak, walking 2 miles were images of renunciation of revenge, not of absolute passivity. In a context where Rome imposed burdens, such as compelling a citizen to carry military equipment for a mile, these words offered an unexpected alternative: respond with inner freedom, not with resentment. The most countercultural teaching of the sermon was the command to love enemies. In an oppressed people, hearing that they should pray for those who persecuted them was disconcerting. Jesus based this idea on the character of God, who makes the sun rise on both the righteous and the unrighteous. Love in this sense was not a feeling, but an active disposition toward the good of the other, even the adversary. This vision transcended the ethnic, political, and religious barriers of the ancient world. Jesus also addressed religious practice, consisting of almsgiving, prayer, and fasting, warning against ostentation. Pious deeds were to be done in secret, not as a public spectacle. To teach about prayer, he offered a simple model that the Christian tradition would preserve as the Lord's Prayer. This prayer began with the holiness of God, continued with the request that his kingdom manifest, and acknowledged daily dependence on bread, the need for mutual forgiveness, and protection from temptation. It was a balanced, humble, and accessible prayer, very different from the long ritual speeches of the time. The sermon also addressed the issue of daily anxiety. In a region where economic uncertainty was common, Jesus called to trust God as provider, without falling into obsessive concern over food or clothing. He did not invite irresponsibility, but a life in which excessive worry did not govern decisions. He pointed out how the birds of the sky and the lilies of the field, familiar elements of the Galilean landscape, lived within a natural order sustained by God. The teaching on moral judgment was equally direct. Jesus asked to avoid destructive criticism, comparing those who judge to someone trying to remove a speck from another's eye while ignoring the beam in their own. The image was deliberately exaggerated, designed to emphasize the inconsistency between judging and not examining one's own life. Still, the message did not deny the need for discernment, as evidenced when he said not to give sacred things to those who would not understand them. The sermon culminated with a warning about the importance of putting his teachings into practice. He compared those who hear and live them to a man who builds his house on rock, resistant to storms, and those who only hear without acting to someone who builds on sand. In a region like Galilee, where torrential rains could transform dry beds into violent streams, the metaphor was clear and close to the experience of his listeners. When Jesus finished speaking, the crowd was astonished. He did not teach like the scribes, who cited authorities and traditions, but as one who has authority in himself. The Sermon on the Mount was not a legal code, but an invitation to a renewed ethics that transcended external norms to reach the human heart. Conflicts with Pharisees, Sadducees, and temple authorities. As the fame of Jesus grew in Galilee and Judea, tensions with the religious groups that dominated the spiritual life of the Jewish people also increased. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the temple authorities represented different currents, each with specific interests within the complex religious and political fabric of the first century. Jesus' preaching focused on inner authenticity and the priority of mercy over ritualism, increasingly conflicted with certain sectors that maintained a rigid interpretation of the law or benefited from the established order. The Pharisees were a lay movement dedicated to strict observance of the law and the oral traditions that complemented it. They valued ritual purity and separation from sin and saw detailed observance as a way to preserve national identity under Roman rule. Although some Pharisees showed genuine interest in Jesus' teachings, many others considered him a threat as his message questioned outward attitudes without inner transformation. When Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, the Pharisees openly criticized him, since these associations broke the social and religious norms they upheld. Jesus responded to these criticisms with concrete examples. On one occasion, seeing a repentant tax collector, he explained that he had not come to call the righteous but sinners. On another, he defended his disciples when they were accused of not fasting as frequently as expected. His responses did not nullify the law, but reinterpreted it from the heart of mercy, which inevitably disturbed those who valued form over substance. The Sabbath was one of the points of greatest friction. The Pharisees observed this day with great zeal, avoiding any activity that could be considered work. When Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, such as the man with the paralyzed hand or the bent woman, the reactions were immediate. For some leaders, healing was equivalent to performing prohibited work. Jesus, for his part, responded by asking whether it was not lawful to do good on the Sabbath. His argument appealed to human logic. Anyone would pull their fallen animal out of a pit, even on a day of rest. The conclusion was clear: the law should serve life, not become an oppressive burden. The Sadducees, on the other hand, represented a group closer to political power. They were priests linked to the Jerusalem aristocracy, controlled the functioning of the temple, and had a convenience-based relationship with Roman authorities. They did not believe in the resurrection or oral traditions, accepting only the written Torah. Although their encounters with Jesus were less frequent than those of the Pharisees, they viewed him with distrust, especially when his popularity threatened the order they administered. One of the most remembered clashes occurred when the Sadducees tried to test his teaching on the resurrection. They presented a hypothetical case about a woman who had been married to 7 brothers, asking whose wife she would be in the resurrection. Jesus responded by indicating that in the future life, human relationships would not follow earthly norms, and cited the Torah to demonstrate that God is the God of the living, not of the dead. The answer not only left the Sadducees' argument unsupported, but also showed Jesus' mastery of the scriptures they considered central. The conflict with the temple authorities grew with each visit of Jesus to Jerusalem. On one occasion, he observed the money changers and merchants in the temple courts. where Roman currency was exchanged for acceptable offerings and animals were sold for sacrifices. Although these practices were common, Jesus denounced the abuse and corruption that had infiltrated them. He overturned the tables, expelled the merchants, and proclaimed that the temple should be a house of prayer. The action had immense symbolic weight. It was a direct critique of the system administered by the high priests. From that moment, the temple leaders openly sought ways to eliminate him. They feared his influence over the people and the possibility that Rome would interpret his acts as subversive. The political tensions in Judea made any popular movement potentially trigger severe reprisals. For the authorities, it was preferable to suppress any figure who could provoke disturbances. With tricky questions, they tried to discredit him. They asked whether it was lawful to pay tribute to Caesar, a trap that placed him between two risks, opposing Rome or losing the support of the people. Jesus asked for a coin and pointed out that it bore Caesar's image. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The response avoided the trap, while simultaneously affirming divine sovereignty and civil responsibility, confounding his opponents. On another occasion, they demanded that he say by what authority he acted. Jesus replied by asking about the origin of John's baptism. Did it come from heaven or from men? Fearing the reaction of the people, they refused to answer. Jesus also did not answer directly, leaving them exposed in their own inconsistency. The tensions were not only theological but also social. Jesus denounced the hypocrisy of certain religious leaders who sought the first places at banquets and synagogues, or who imposed heavy burdens on the people without lifting a finger to ease them. These public denunciations affected the image of the ruling groups and contributed to the progressive deterioration of the relationship. Despite everything, some members of these groups approached Jesus sincerely. Nicodemus, a Pharisee, visited him at night to discuss the kingdom of God. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, sympathized with him and later played a key role after his death. These exceptions showed that rejection was not absolute, but it was growing. As his entry into Jerusalem approached, tensions reached their peak. The people received him enthusiastically, while the authorities saw in every gesture a potential trigger for conflict. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem took place during the Passover festival, the time of year when the city welcomed tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over Judea, Galilee, and the Jewish diaspora. Jerusalem, normally bustling, transformed into a crowded center, filled with merchants, families, and religious groups. The Roman presence also intensified. The authorities feared that the combination of religious fervor and historical memory of liberation could trigger some kind of revolt. In this climate of political and spiritual tension, Jesus decided to make his public entry. The Gospels narrate that as he approached Jerusalem, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples to a nearby village to bring a donkey and its colt. This detail was not accidental. The prophet Zechariah had announced that the King of Israel would come humble and mounted on a donkey, an image very different from the war horses or imperial chariots associated with political power. The choice of the animal conveyed a message of meekness, not military strength, and deliberately connected his action with the messianic expectations circulating among the people. Riding the donkey, Jesus proceeded toward the city along the path descending from the Mount of Olives, a route loaded with prophetic significance for the Jews. The crowd accompanying him was made up of pilgrims who knew him from Galilee, followers who had seen his teachings and miracles, and travelers who, curious about the rumors, joined the procession. People spread cloaks along the path, a gesture historically reserved for welcoming kings and victorious leaders. Others cut branches from trees and waved them as they went along. The song that echoed through the crowd had ancient roots. Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The scene caused a stir in the city. Matthew notes that all Jerusalem was stirred, wondering who this man receiving such acclaim was. The answers varied. Some recognized him as the prophet from Galilee, others as a teacher, and some, more enthusiastic, shared the idea that he was the Messiah. Within the walls, however, the reception was not uniform. The Pharisees, seeing the magnitude of the demonstration, asked Jesus to silence his followers. He responded with a memorable phrase, "If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." The scene reflected the clash between popular enthusiasm and the authorities' concern. Upon finally entering Jerusalem, Jesus went to the temple, the religious heart of the nation. There he observed the activity of money changers and animal sellers. Although these practices were part of the sacrificial system, Jesus perceived corruption, abuse, and improper use of the sacred space. With determination, he expelled the merchants, overturned tables, and declared that they had turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves. This bold gesture immediately drew the attention of the temple leaders, who saw him as a direct threat to their authority and the established religious order. After this act, Jesus began teaching daily in the temple courts. The crowd listened with pleasure, which further increased the conflict with the religious leaders who feared losing their influence over the people. The chief priests and scribes began looking for a way to arrest him without causing a riot, aware that the city was full of sympathetic pilgrims. During those days, Jesus performed significant actions that intensified the symbolism of his triumphant entry. He wept as he looked upon Jerusalem from above, lamenting that the city had not recognized what leads to peace. The prophecy of destruction he pronounced reflected his perception that the combination of spiritual rejection and political tensions would bring severe consequences for the people. He also cursed a barren fig tree, a symbol of a fruitless nation, and told parables aimed at the authorities who rejected him. Each of these actions was part of the growing tension surrounding his presence in the city. The crowd continued to watch him with a mix of admiration and expectation. Some hoped he would take the next step toward a political messianic proclamation. Others followed him for the depth of his teachings. But the main temple leaders, the strictest Pharisees, and the priestly aristocracy saw in him an increasingly dangerous figure. His popularity and message challenged structures that had remained firm for generations. The contrast between the crowd's joy and the authorities' fear was evident. Jesus did not seek to reinforce nationalist aspirations, but the way people interpreted his actions fueled the tension. In a festive climate, with thousands of pilgrims watching every movement, any gesture could trigger unpredictable reactions. The Last Supper, the betrayal, and the arrest. The week of Passover was progressing in Jerusalem, and the tensions surrounding Jesus were becoming increasingly visible. Despite the crowd listening to him enthusiastically, the religious authorities had already decided to arrest him. They feared doing it during the day in front of the people, so they sought a discreet opportunity. In this atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion, Jesus met with his disciples to celebrate a dinner that would have decisive significance in the Christian tradition, the Last Supper. The setting was a room on the upper floor of a house, probably in one of the oldest areas of the city. Jesus had instructed Peter and John to prepare the Passover. Following his directions, they found a man carrying a water jar and followed him to the house whose owner offered the place. The preparation included the Passover lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and wine, elements that recalled the liberation from Egypt. As evening fell, the disciples gathered around the low table, reclining according to Jewish custom. During the dinner, Jesus spoke words that altered the traditional meaning of the Passover celebration. He took the bread, broke it, and said it was his body given for them. Then he took a cup of wine and declared it was his blood, shed for the forgiveness of sins, pointing to a new covenant. This deeply symbolic gesture had no precedent in Jewish liturgy. It was not about abolishing Passover, but reinterpreting it in light of what was about to happen. In the intimate atmosphere of the dinner, Jesus also mentioned that one of those present would betray him. The statement caused surprise, concern, and questions among the disciples. They all looked at each other, unable to imagine that one of them could hand over their teacher. Jesus indicated that the one sharing the bread with him was the traitor, but he did not openly mention the name at that moment according to some Gospels. Judas, who had already spoken with the authorities to deliver Jesus, remained seated, wrapped in a silence only he understood. After receiving a bite from Jesus' hands, Judas left the room. The evangelist John notes that it was night, an expression that not only describes the hour but also the moral climate surrounding the action. During that same dinner, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, a task reserved for servants. This act completely inverted the social hierarchy of the ancient world. Jesus taught that greatness in the kingdom was measured by the ability to serve, not by prestige. Peter, surprised by the gesture, initially reacted with resistance but eventually accepted. The scene marked a fundamental point in his teaching. Leadership must be based on humility. After the dinner, Jesus led his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane at the foot of the Mount of Olives. It was a usual meeting place, surrounded by ancient olive trees, where solitude facilitated prayer. As night advanced, Jesus withdrew with Peter, James, and John. He asked them to watch with him, aware that his hour was approaching. Then he went off alone to pray. His prayer reflected deep anguish. He asked that, if possible, that cup pass from him, but he submitted to the Father's will. The tone of the narrative shows the humanity of Jesus facing imminent suffering. Upon returning, he found his disciples asleep. 3 times he woke them, asking them to pray so as not to fall into temptation. Fatigue and bewilderment dominated the group. The night was moving toward an outcome that none of them, except Jesus, fully understood. Finally, Judas arrived with a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent by the chief priests. To identify Jesus, Judas gave him a kiss, a signal agreed with the guards. The act condensed the tension between apparent closeness and real betrayal. When the soldiers approached to arrest Jesus, one of the disciples, later identified as Peter, drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus stopped him and ordered the weapon to be put away, emphasizing that his mission would not be fulfilled through violence. He then touched the wounded man and healed him, even in that critical moment. Jesus asked why they were arresting him like a criminal, reminding them that he had taught openly in the temple every day. But the leaders had chosen the darkness to avoid riots. As he was led away, the disciples fled, afraid of being captured as well. The Gospel of Mark even mentions a young man who escaped, leaving behind his garment, a detail that emphasizes the confusion of the moment. The arrest led to a series of nighttime interrogations. Jesus was taken before Annas, the former high priest, and then before Caiaphas, the acting high priest. There they sought testimonies to condemn him, but the accounts were contradictory. Finally, they accused him of blasphemy for speaking of the destruction and restoration of the temple and for declaring himself the Son of God. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted, and broke into tears when he realized what had happened. The night ended with Jesus in custody, beaten and mocked by guards, while the authorities prepared to take him to the only power capable of executing a death sentence, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The crucifixion at Golgotha and his death. When dawn came, Jesus was brought before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The Jewish authorities, although they had found religious reasons to condemn him, did not have the power to execute the death penalty. Therefore, they presented political accusations. They claimed that Jesus proclaimed himself king, incited the people, and represented a threat to the imperial order. Pilate, accustomed to handling local tensions and suppressing disturbances, interrogated Jesus directly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus answered soberly, neither denying nor confirming in the expected terms, making it clear that his kingdom was not based on Roman structures of power. Pilate perceived that the conflict had internal roots and that Jesus did not constitute a real political danger. However, the pressure from the temple leaders and the crowd they had gathered put him in a delicate position. It was his responsibility to maintain stability during Passover, a particularly sensitive time. To avoid problems, he tried to release Jesus through a local custom, freeing a prisoner chosen by the people. Among the prisoners was Barabbas, accused of sedition and murder. When Pilate proposed releasing Jesus, the crowd asked for Barabbas. The situation reflected the political tension in Judea and the volatile climate that could turn against the governor if he acted against the expectations of the dominant group at that moment. Pilate, attempting to distance himself from responsibility, washed his hands in front of the crowd, symbolically declaring that he was not guilty of that man's blood. He then handed Jesus over to be crucified. Before the execution, the Roman soldiers subjected him to a brutal flogging, a common practice before crucifixion. They used whips with fragments of bone or metal that tore the skin. Afterwards, mocking the accusation against him, they dressed him in a purple robe, put a reed in his hand as a scepter, and wove a crown of thorns that they placed on his head. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted amid blows and scorn. Bearing the patibulum, that is, the horizontal piece of the cross, Jesus was led to the place of execution, known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. The path was observed by pilgrims and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Some lamented, others insulted him, and some simply watched. At one point along the way, the soldiers forced a man named Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross behind Jesus, probably because he was already too weakened by the punishments he had received. Upon arriving at Golgotha, the soldiers offered Jesus a drink mixed with wine and myrrh, a mild narcotic, but he did not take it. They stripped him of his clothes, which they later divided among themselves by casting lots. This act, common in Roman executions, reinforced the public degradation of the condemned. They nailed him to the cross and raised the beam. Crucifixion was an execution method designed to cause prolonged pain and humiliation. Victims could remain alive for hours or even days, depending on their prior physical condition. Above his head, they placed a sign written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." For the Roman authorities, the inscription served as a political warning. For the religious leaders, it was a reason for mockery. For his followers, a statement full of irony. Jesus was crucified between two criminals, one on his right and the other on his left, a position that emphasized the intention to present him as an enemy of order. The Gospels recount that the crowd continued to gather. Some religious leaders mocked him. He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah. The soldiers also joined the mockery, offering him vinegar. One of the criminals crucified insulted him, while the other asked him to remember him when he reached his kingdom. Jesus replied that he would be with him in paradise, an act of compassion even amid extreme suffering. Despite the pain, Jesus spoke several times from the cross. He entrusted the care of his mother to the disciple called the Beloved, showing a filial concern even in his final moments. He also expressed one of the most complex lines in the gospel narrative, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting the beginning of Psalm 22, a poem that starts in desolation but ends in hope. The phrase reflected the depth of his anguish and his identification with human suffering. At noon, the Gospels describe a darkness that covered the region until 3 in the afternoon. They do not specify its nature, but include it as a dramatic sign of the moment. Finally, Jesus exclaimed, "It is finished," and gave up his spirit. His death was not only the conclusion of physical torture, but the culmination of his mission according to the canonical accounts. To hasten the death of the crucified, soldiers would often break the legs of the condemned, preventing them from supporting themselves to breathe. When they reached Jesus, they found him already dead. To confirm his passing, a soldier pierced his side with a spear. The death of a crucified person could take time, but Jesus' prior condition, beaten, flogged, and weakened by the emotional weight of the previous night, would have accelerated the process. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Jewish council who had not participated in the condemnation, asked Pilate for permission to remove the body. Nicodemus, another sympathizer, accompanied him. Following Jewish customs, they wrapped the body in cloths with perfumes and placed it in a new tomb hewn in rock. It was a tomb close to the place of execution, allowing compliance with burial norms before the start of the Sabbath. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, including Mary Magdalene, watched where he was placed. The stone was rolled to close the entrance of the tomb, and the leaders requested that the site be secured, fearing that his disciples might try to take the body. Thus ended his earthly life according to the canonical narrative, closing a trajectory marked by teachings, healings, conflicts, and decisions that transformed those who followed him. And while the city returned to its apparent calm, a new world would open in the lives of his followers after 3 days. But that is another story.